Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Learning Daf Maseches Kesubos Daf Kuf Beis, starting a new parak today. The new parak is going to be discussing the commitments that are made either verbally or in writing, that are made between people. Here we're going to be using a husband and a wife as an example, and whether or not they're as binding as we want them to be or not. And the Mishnah opens as follows. And the Mishnah is at the open of the parak on the bottom of Kuf Aleph and the Beis. And the Mishnah writes, "Hanose es ha'isha." A man meets a woman and wants to marry her, and she already has a child from another marriage. And she negotiates, upaska imo, she makes a psak with him, they agree together. I have a daughter from Reuven, from my first husband, you're Shimon. We can get married, but part of the deal is that you need to feed my daughter out of the gates. You need to make a commitment to feed her for 5 years. He is obligated to feed her for those 5 years. Let's say this relationship with Shimon didn't work out, and she then marries somebody else. Now she marries Levi, and she makes the same deal. Here too, she negotiates on behalf of her daughter that her daughter should have 5 years of income in the form of payments for food. Halacha is that this new husband as well, Levi, is chayv lazona 5 shanim. And lo yomar harishon l'chetavo etzla ezona. The person, the Shimon, he can't say, "I'll only agree to feed her when she lives in my house," meaning up until the time that we get divorced. No. He has to make sure that she gets paid no matter where the wife is, no matter where this mother is, even in a new marriage. Both of the husbands, Shimon and Levi, cannot come together and say, "Hey, we're the ones who are obligated to feed her. So we'll feed her by splitting the cost of the payments." No, each of them made a commitment to fund her entire food. Ella echad zana, one of them would actually give her food. Ve'echad nosein ladmei mizonos. So really, and we'll see this language at the end of the Mishnah, they've become balecho. This isn't even about mizonos per se. Their payment is in the form of mizonos, but really what ended up happening is that the husband made a commitment when he got married. Both husbands, Shimon and Levi, made a commitment to pay mizonos to this daughter. Okay, Nises. Let's say this daughter, who's been the beneficiary now of two fathers who are paying for her food, Habal nosen la mizonos. Her husband is feeding her mizonos. Vehein nosen la dmei mizonos. She's getting triples. She gets food from her husband, as is the normal routine. She gets food from Shimon, which was her mother's second husband, and then also from Levi, her mother's third husband. So instead, let's say every month she gets $200. Now she's profiting $400 every month, 200, 400, 600 from every husband. Every husband, that's what it is. Mesu. What if Shimon or Levi die? So the halacha is benosehen nizones minichasim b'nechorin. His own daughters, Reuven and Shimon and Levi's daughters, their daughters get fed only from properties that are b'nei chorin, that are liquid properties that have no ties to them. This daughter with whom her mother had made deals between Shimon and Levi that she should get the 5 years worth of mizonos. Why? Because, says the Gemara, this is not regular mizonos. There was a contract that was made between the mother, let's call her Rachel, and Shimon, and then subsequently Levi. So therefore, she's going to collect money as a Baal Aschov, and that is the din of the Gemara. So says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, this is an uncommon line for a Mishnah. Normally we see this in the Amoraim. Hapikchim, the smarter husbands, they knew that when they got into this deal, they knew that when they were marrying a woman who was coming with children in tow, they would say, I'll feed your daughter for up to 5 years, provided that you still live in my house. But once you leave my house, you gotta be clear on the deal. If you say 5 years with no addendums, with no qualifications, that's 5 years. You get divorced a year later, you lost a lot of cash. That's on you. Be smart about it, says the Mishnah. If you're a pikeach, you'll know to add another limiting factor, which is that as long as we're married. The Mishnah opens, and this is really going to be the crux of our conversation today, is with a machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Itmar, ha'omer lechavero chayv ani lach mana. If a person says verbally, it is true that I owe you $100. So that's a machlokes, just verbal commitment. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayev, v'Reish Lakish amar pater. Machlokas Amoraim. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. Hechidami. Either Amar Lahu Atemedai. If you want to say the reason is because it's as if when he admitted that he owed 100, it's as if there are witnesses. If that's true, my time is Reish Lakish to Kapatar. If the verbal commitment is no different than saying, hey, I've got witnesses here, if they're halachically equivalent, then there's no reason to be lenient like Reish Lakish. And he's lo Amar Lahu Atemedai. If he doesn't say that these are the witnesses, if he doesn't say that, and it's really just a verbal comment, foaming at the mouth, as it were, my time is Rabbi Yochanan Kamachayev. There's not enough here in a vacuum to say one way or the other. Says the Gemara, Olam Deloka Amar Lo Hatemedai. Really, no, there was no admission of this is equivalent to my Edim. Rather, what's going on here? 4 lines from the bottom, Kufal from Midbeis. He put it in writing. However, when he put it in writing, there were no Edim. It's effectively an IOU. So if I take a piece of paper and I write down, I owe you $100, love, Phil. No Edim, just a personal admission. Is that more powerful than the verbal? Yes or no? And the Gemara here says, this is how Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would look at this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Alima Milsa Deshtara, a written document is more powerful because that is, even without signatures, Kimanda Amar Lahu Atemedim Dami. Okay, just a written IOU is more powerful than the verbal. Reish Lakish Amar Pater, Lo Alima Milsa Deshtara. If we write it down, say it out loud, there's no Edim on it. What are we talking about here? And the Gemara here, over the next 2 proofs, is going to try and bring a raya to Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara says, tonight we have a Mishnah. Our Mishnah. She marries Shimon and she has a daughter in tow, a 5-year-old kid. And she says, you have to feed my daughter until she's 10 years old. What did we say? The halacha is chayv l'zono chamesh shanim, obligated. My la kihai gavna. What do we see over here? Maybe that is this case over here. And Rashi goes through the details of this case. And Rashi says on the very bottom line, he says, Ve'ein sham lo kinyan v'lo chasima. Because the have a star chasam biyada, had it been perfectly signed, nothing to talk about. That would be in the bag. Everybody would understand that. So obviously, this case of our Mishnah must be a raya for one of the shitas of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And which one is it a raya for? Well, we see that the contract is binding, even though there were no edim. That is Rabbi Yochanan. So says the Gemara, my love ki I gav. Answers the Gemara, lo, that's not what we're talking about. That star that you're talking about is not just stama star. That's part of Bishtari Psikta. Bishtari Psikta are the agreements, effectively what they're kind of like tonight. Like, well, what do you bring to the marriage? That's a different kind of document. Uchadir of Gidal, top of Kupez Amar, top line. The Amar of Gidal Amarav, Kama Tanosein Levincha. This is what the Mechutanim discuss. They say, oh, how much are you going to give to your son? I'll give $10,000. How much are you going to put into the marriage for your daughter? And amdu v'kitshu, and then they stand up and they haret mekudesha, she's engaged kanu. The halacha is that whatever they said verbally under those circumstances is absolutely binding because it's a shtar psikta. It's a very unique type of shtar. It's not this conditional balchov thing that we have in our mission. Not the same case. We'll discuss this case a little bit more. So we tried to bring a riot from our Mishnah to Rav Yochanan, and we were not able to. Toshma, let's try again, 5 lines down. Kasav lekohen, let's say that a man writes to a kohen, a man who just happened to have a son. He is a Yisrael, she's a Yisrael, first birth. So we have the coalescing, we have the parallel lives of he's saying out loud, I owe you 5 slime. At the same time that he has a mitzvah d'oraisa to do pidyon haben. So he says out loud, Kasav lekohen, he writes to a kohen, Shani chayv l'cha 5 slime. So very strange response of the Gemara. What does the Brisa say? Chayav litin lo 5 slime. Ladina. Once he writes that, he's obligated to pay the 5 slime. However, ubno eno padui. Super weird. Why would be no eno padui? We'll see in a minute why that's true, but it's a very strange presentation. So what do we see from here? That he wrote something down. There are no edim. It's binding. That sounds like the sheet of Rav Yochanan. The Gemara says no rayas from the case of the Chamesh Slime. Shani Hasam de Meshuba Lemi Doraisa. Because that mitzvah Doraisa, he's obligated. It's pasuk and chumash. That's just the way things are. Yachi Amai Kasav. Why is it that it says Kasav? You're right. The Ksav is irrelevant. The Ksav is irrelevant. That was only written Kedei Levar Lo Kohen, so that you can direct the money to a particular Kohen. I want to give it to my brother-in-law who's a Kohen. Great. That's great. But no reason to write it down. Yachi says the Gemara, but no, what's the problem over here? Everything seems to be aligned perfectly, except for the fact that you said that the kid is not, he still hasn't had a pidyon haben yet. So the Gemara says you're absolutely right, and the way we should answer this is Kideula, third of the way down. Damar Ula, Davar Torah, Padui, Lichashayitin. Halacha lamaisa, the pidyon haben does work. My time amru beno eno padui. Why then do we say that it's as if the child is not padui, that the father didn't fulfill the mitzvah? This is Gzeira D'Rabbanan. Gzeira Shema Yomru Podin B'Shtaros. We're afraid that because we wrote it down so that we could direct the money to a particular Kohen, we're afraid that people might think that there's a pidyon when you hand over the shtar itself without the coins. Therefore, the Gemara had to say that this was not the case. We didn't want people to be confused about it. So when a person was giving over a document that says, I'm going to give you 5 slayim to person X, to Kohen X, we said we don't want people to misunderstand and make a mistake with the mitzvah pidyon haben. The mitzvah pidyon haben is not a conceptual or even a contract type of thing. You have to hand the 5 coins over to a particular person. So I've done this as a moel. You show up 30 days later and you do the pidyon haben for them. They have no clue, the secular crowd. They have to pay for the silver. I give them the 5 coins. They give them to the Kohen. Fine, that's the transaction. But if it was just a piece of paper, the shtar, that's not enough. So the Gemara is teaching us a subtlety, seemingly, I don't know if this is Lamaisa, a subtlety that you cannot get out of the mitzvah pidyon haben with a contract. It has to only be with coins. Again, no raya one way or the other for Rav Yochanan or Reish Lakish. And the Gemara says halfway down, Amar Rabba Kitanoi. Maybe Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish are like the following machlokes in the Tanoim. Let's say there's a document between Ruvain and Shimon. You owe me $100. And afterwards, only afterwards, an Arev signs at the bottom, and Phil is your guarantor, and he'll make sure you get paid. So I come in as the guarantor after the document is signed. The halacha is gove minachasim b'nei chorim. Then, based on that, they can collect from the properties that are b'nei chorim of the Arev. Take a look at Rashi, a little bit more than halfway down. Hamalve, who can collect? A malve can collect min ha'arev, but v'lo minachasim mishubadim. Kivin de la'achar chisum ashtarhu havi lekem malve al peh. And malve al peh is different than being malve b'shtar. So that's what the Gemara says, is that an arev is able to collect, but only from b'nei chorim. An arev can be collected from, but only from b'nei chorim. Ma'isa balifnei Rabbi Shmuel. V'amar go b'minchasim b'nei chorim, like we just saw. But Ben Nanas didn't agree. Amar lo Ben Nanas. Ben Nanas, who was a Tana, he said to Rabbi Shmuel, no way. Eino gove lo minchasim b'nei chorim v'lo minchasim mishuban. He's late to the party. The arev signed after the whole star was already signed. He's coming in past the time, past the end of the game here. So Amar lo lama, he says to Ben Nanas, why would you say that they get nothing? Amar lo harei shahayachonik es chaver b'shuk. Let's say that you see a scenario where Ruvain owes Shimon money and he's literally strangling him to get his money back. So Ruvain's strangling Shimon, and Shimon's friend comes to the rescue. He says, calm down. Leave him alone. In this moment of duress, Levi comes in to save Shimon from the vice grip of Ruvain. So the halacha is pater. He's not obligated to pay. That's shelo al emunaso helvehu. That's not how the loan was done. So this is machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Ben Nanas as to whether or not a person who's an arev after the signatures counts as someone who can bring about a burden on the properties that are b'nei chorin, yes or no. That's machlokas. Lema Rav Yochanan to Amar Rabbi Shmuel. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan is like Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael seems to say that there is this concept of a chiyuv of b'nei chorin, afal pi that there are no signatures. That's just like what we were trying to say earlier. That's Rabbi Yochanan. But Reish Lakish, maybe Damar ki Ben Nanas, who says no, that there's really nothing going on here and no transactions can happen with this kind of general laissez-faire setup without Edom. Says the Gemara, that's not possible. Last line of Kuf Beis Amar Ben Nanas kulei amlo pligi. No one has any confusion about the shitas of Ben Nanas. Ki pligi, where would there be a machlokas between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish if you wanted to apply them to this machlokas at all? It would only be within the shita of Rabbi Shmuel, top of Kupes, and basically please leave it to Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shmuel, party lines. That's easy. Rabbi Yochanan, in our case, at the very bottom of Kufal from base at the open of the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan says that if a person can verbally commit with no edim, and the halacha is it would be halachically binding. And Rabbi Shmuel does something quite similar. But Reish Lakish on the second line of Kuf Beis and Beis, what would he say? Reish Lakish, Ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Shmuel hasam ela d'shayich le'el shibuda deoraisa. When it comes to the case of Rabbi Shmuel, that's when we're dealing with a shibud deoraisa. Could be a ksuba, could be something that is naturally halachically binding. Aval hacha, in the case of that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing about, this case where a person just says out loud, "You owe me $100." In such a case, lo shayich shibuda deoraisa. So the cases are not comparable. In the conclusion, we don't know. We don't have any rayas one way or the other for Rabbi Yochanan or for Reish Lakish. No clarity in the Gemara whatsoever. So that means that the case that we started with, if a person were to say out loud, "I owe you $100," is that binding? That remains a machlokes in the Gemara. Of course, we have Kalei Apsak, we have Shulchan Aruch, but just from the Gemara itself, it's unclear. And how do we paskin? We paskin like Rav Yochanan, that a verbal commitment would be binding. So if I say out loud, "I owe you $100," that is halachically binding. Okay, let's continue with the next sugya within a sugya. 5 lines down, Kuf Beis Mid Beis. We're going to be heading until the 5th line from the bottom of the 2 dots. Says the Gemara as follows: Gufa Amar of Gidal Amarab. Kama Tanosin Levincha Kach V'Kach. We said that the Mechutanim sit down, and the father of the bride says to the father of the groom, "How much will you give?" And he says, "Kach v'kach v'kama atanosin levitcha kach v'kach." That they discuss how much each side of the family is going to bring in. And amdu b'kitshukan. We said that that's binding. Hein hadvar maniknim be'amira. And this is an example of something that is going to be nikne be'amira, that just by verbal commitment they are halachically bound to put money into the pot to basically fund this couple. Omar Rava says, Mistabra Milsa de Rav. Rava says, I could understand this idea of Rav Bibito Nara. Oh, I could only understand it if his daughter is a Nara. Why? Cares about if she's a Nara or not. Says the Gemara, the Kamati Hanal Yade. Because where does the money for Kedushin go when the daughter's a Nara? To the father. Aval Bogeres de Lomati Hanal Yade. But maybe we would argue that this verbal commitment between the mechutanim, that when we're talking about a daughter who's a bogeres already, maybe we should say that because there is no hanash demata liyade, because why? She's a bogeres. The ksuba, the kedushin money goes to her. So then, maybe I would have thought that the binding, that there is nothing binding about the verbal commitments between the mechutanim. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. Why? Amarav afilu bogeres. First of all, Rav himself says that it's true even by a bogeres. So the argument you gave is wrong, just to source within source. You can't have Rav contradicting himself. And even if you didn't have that, you'd have another reason. Avia ben, myhanas asal yade. You're only giving me one side of the equation, which is the bride. Is the bride a bogeres? Is she a nara? By the nara, the father gets the kedusha kesef, and by the bogeres not. What about the groom's side? He's paying no matter what, no matter how old the wife is. So it can't be that you're bringing in money and the hana of the money that you get is going to be the gorim for the mechutanim to have their deal be full. And that's ridiculous. Of course not. Ella says the Gemara, behahi hana deka mechasne. The fact that they're getting married. What is the hana that makes this binding? The hana that makes it binding is that the mechutanim are happy that their children are getting married, that they're getting the kamechatani ahadade gamre umakne lahadade. Okay, very good. So the Gemara says that we tried to put in this strange condition, and the Gemara rejects it outright. And the Gemara says a third of the way down. Amalei Ravina leRavashi dvarim halalu nitnu likasev alo nitnu likasev. When the mechutanim are talking, can they write it down in a star afterwards? L'may nafkamina. If you write it down in a star, then they can be collected from nechasim mishubadim. If it's verbal, not allowed. It's malval peh. So in this case, what do we do? Says the Gemara, this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, Amar le lo nitnu likasev. You're not allowed to write it down. Asks the Gemara, take a look at the language that we saw at the end of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Eisvei, hapikrin hayu kosvin al menas she'ezonis bitcha chameshanim kozman she'at imi. So what does our Mishnah say? Well, it seems like they took a verbal contract and wrote it down, because our Mishnah says the smart people will say, "Yeah, I'll feed your daughter. I'm happy to marry you. I love your daughter as if she's my own, and I'll feed her. But I know how things work, and if we get divorced, I don't want to be on the hook. So as long as you live in my house, built-in condition." But what is the language there? Kosvin. So there we see kosvin, and therefore seemingly it should generate the ability to collect that money from the chasim mishubadim. Mishnah says, the Gemara says a very strange response. We've seen this in Shas before. My kosvin, omrim. Why did our Mishnah say kosev? It's a lav dafka. It's a very loose terminology. And really it's omrim. You're not allowed to put it in writing unless it was already in writing. Fine. The kari leila amira ksiva. There's nothing more exacting than Shas. I mean, Chumash. Okay, than Torah. That's broadly. And you're calling ksiva amira. That is the biggest possible difference in shtaros, that you could malva al peh. These are totally drastically different things. How could our Mishnah write kosev and mean amira? Says the Gemara yes, we do have precedents for that. Hatznan, hakosev leishto, we learned this 20 blot ago. Hakosev leishto dinu dvar men benichsaych, v'tani rebchia haomer leishto. He qualifies and says that case is actually talking about amira. Okay, so we tried to answer our question, and we don't have a raya one way or the other yet, other than the fact that the Gemara says lo nitnu likasev. We tried to ask from our Mishnah, and we didn't have a strong raya from our Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to try again, halfway down. Tashma, ein kosvin shtar erisin or nisun al elamidash shneim. You cannot write a shtar erisin or a shtar nisun unless both people are involved. Both people are on the same page. Why? Because you're collecting from nechasim mishubadim. People have to know what's going on. They have to be privy to the details. What's implied? Hamidash nehem. What if everyone agrees? Kosvin. Then you are allowed to write it. My lav stari psikta. Isn't this talking about what we're talking about, which is the document where the mechutanim sit down and discuss the shari psikta? I'm going to give X, you're going to give Y. So what do we see from over here? We have ein kosvin unless X, and if X is fulfilled, then kosvin. So we see that kosei should be allowed. Says the Gemara lo that we're talking about shtare erisin mamish. We're talking about the actual star erisin. Isha nicknames begimel drachem bekesef star rubia. This is the star erisin. Kiderav papa v'rav shravia. There's a machlokas and the Amoraim about the following. The itmar. Kasvu lishma, if he writes a star for the right reason, but v'shalomi daita, but she doesn't know about it, which was the problem that we presented a moment ago. Rabba v'Ravina, it should be Rava. Rava v'Ravina amre mekudeshes. What does Rav Papa say? Rav Papa v'Rav Shravya amre ein mekudeshes. That she is in fact not married. So we seem to paskin, or at least in the flow of the Gemara is saying that if we're talking about Rav Papa and Rav Shravya, who side with the fact that if a star is written lishma, but v'shalomi daita, she's ein mekudeshes, so we therefore have no raya from that case of el midash nehem, because we don't know what the rule would be in a general case. We don't know. We only know in that specific case. So let's try one more time. Tashma. Mesu, we had said in our Mishnah that if one of the husbands dies, so let's say Shimon or Levi, her second or third husbands die after they've committed to fund her daughter for the next 5 years. So this is fascinating, as we saw in our Mishnah, that his daughters can only be fed from freed properties. The daughter for whom the mother had negotiated 5 years of food, why? Because what did our Mishnah say? And there we see that a verbal commitment can bring about collecting from nechasim mishubadim. So then there's no difference to write it down. Just write it down. She's already verbally able to collect from nechasim mishubadim. We presented the question in our Gemara: are you allowed to be? The Gemara said, "Dvarim halalu nitnu likasev v'lo nitnu likasev." Can these things be written down to generate a chiyuv from payment from the nechasim mishubadim? Well, the answer should be yes, because we have our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, there was an actual kinyan that took place with this new daughter. When Shimon married Rachel, and Rachel brought her daughter Chana into the marriage, they actually made a kinyan, and therefore, because of that kinyan, now she has access to nechasim mishubadim for her mizonos. Yihachi benos nami. What about his own daughters? His own daughters can't collect from nechasim mishubadim. Says the Gemara, b'shekana lezu. The star. You're talking about a kinyan. The kinyan was made when he got married. This is his first marriage, her second marriage. She has a 5-year-old. So it's just technically, who was present at the time of the kinyan? The 5-year-old kid from the wife's marriage. But his daughters weren't there. Umay Pascha. Well, how does this all work out? Says the Gemara, very simple. Ihi, this 5-year-old girl from who's Rachel's daughter, Ihi Dahavya. She was alive at the time that the kinyan took place. Mahanila kinyan, therefore the kinyan worked, that she should get fed, and therefore she can collect from nechasim mishubadim. But Banos, his daughters, they don't have a b'shas kinyan. Maybe they weren't born yet. Says the Gemara, v'lo mahanilo kinyan. It's just very technical. Like, I'm sorry, it's uncomfortable if I have daughters and my daughters can only collect from nechasim b'nei chorim, but my wife's daughter from a previous marriage gets to collect from nechasim mishubadim. That daughter we're treating the stepdaughter even better than our own kids. But what can I do? The kinyan wasn't made for her. The kinyan was made when the other kids were alive. Says the Gemara, lav dafka. I can easily paint a picture where even Shimon's daughters could have been alive. How so? Says the Gemara, vehechidami kigon degarsha vehadra. So Rachel marries Shimon, and Rachel brings a 5-year-old into the marriage. Fine, but she doesn't make this contract yet. Then Rachel and Shimon have kids together. And then they write this, and then they divorce, and then they get married again, and the contract is made. It's easy to create a case where his daughters were alive at the time of this contract. Says Gemara, answer number 2, 3 lines before the white lines. Mahani la kinyan. She who doesn't have regular rules of T'nai Bezdin, there the kinyan works. But Banos, the daughters to Isnahu b'T'nai Bezdin, they have regular forms of getting paid, of getting fed by her father. So when it comes to the father with his stepdaughter, there aren't regular rules in place. We have to build those rules. With his own daughters, there's no kinyan there. They're already being fed. The Gemara is very bothered by this. Migra gare, they should be treated less than the stepdaughter. It doesn't even make any sense. We got to figure it out. Says the Gemara, and we'll conclude this for today, right on time. El benosav hainu taima came into isnu b'tnai bezdin, because the daughters are part of Tanai Bez, namely because fathers have to feed their daughters. So it's very likely the case that before this father died, or whatever the case may be, Amar, we would say, Sirare aspasinhu, that they grabbed bags of money. In other words, that the father took care of them. The daughters don't have to worry. The daughters are not going to be treated better than the stepdaughter. Sorry, the stepdaughter is not going to be treated better than the daughter. The daughters will have access to the father's funds. We'll stop right here at the 2 dots, 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Beis Amud Beis. Tomorrow we'll learn Daf Kuf Gimel, not a small blot. And then Tuesday, Emir Hashem, we will learn Daf Kuf Dalet, and we'll be all on pace. Wishing you all a beautiful day.
What time is Daf?